The space traders said that they would have 16 days for the United States' response. And on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, they would depart, carrying with them every black man, woman, and child back to their home world. January 2nd. In the few hours since the space traders' offer, the White House and Congress had been inundated with calls from constituents. The president was unsurprised to hear that the vast majority spontaneously urged acceptance of the space traders' offer. The president asked Gleason Golightly, a conservative black economics professor and his unofficial black cabinet member, to attend his meeting. Gleason had always been a party member, and it seemed truly conservative. As you know, Mr. President, I have supported this administration's policies that have led to repeal of some civil rights. I have been willing to be a good soldier for the party, even though my people call me an Uncle Tom. Mr. President, my support of this administration entitles me to be heard on the space traders' offer. I disagree strongly with the Secretary of the Interior and the Attorney General when they propose what they propose is not universal selective service for blacks, but population banishment. You cannot condemn 20 million people because they are black and thus fit fodder for trade. I highly doubt that the Secretary of the Interior would be so willing to trade his friends and family if it was him instead of me and mine. The President replied smoothly, "We will give your position full weight in our full weight. We must get going. We have much work to do." January 3rd. An anti-trade coalition gathering of black, white civil leaders and liberal politicians had been working to set up a legal framework for which to reject the space traders' offer. At this moment, Gleason Golightly took the floor. "Flying in the face of our history, you believe that what white people want is actual justice for blacks. What you do not recognize is the reason for racism is because white people do not want black people to have what they have. For this reason, I propose we accept the space traders' offer and institute propaganda that they want to lead us to a land of milk and honey, a virtual paradise." He paused and looked over the sea of faces. They shouted out, "Seller, sellout, traitor, ultimate Uncle Tom." January 4th. The President said on a national address that he was taking very seriously the calls to accept the space traders' offer while still listening to those who suggested that it was wrong. January 7th. Groups supporting the offer were still taking seriously calls that it would be unconstitutional to accept the space traders' offer. For this reason, states quickly passed the 27th Amendment, which said, without any regards to previous interpretations or letters of the law, that all United States citizens were subject to the call of Congress to select the special services in order to necessarily protect the United States' domestic and international interests. January 11th. Unconfirmed reports had suggested that trade negotiators were attempting to offer up all African Americans currently serving in the United States incarceration system, which they noted would account for half of all black males in the 20 to 29 age range. Or if that wouldn't work, perhaps just those who occupied space in the inner cities. The space traders warned that unless steps were taken to prevent the massive numbers of middle-class African Americans leaving the country, their offer would be rescinded. An executive order was issued closing down the borders until this offer had been resolved. January 15th. Many whites had been trying hard to not allow the space traders' offer to be passed, but as the usual fate of minorities went up for referendum or a special vote, the results were never really in doubt. 70 to 30% voted to change the Constitution to set up a legal framework to accept the space traders' offer. Gleason Golightly was told he would have permission to leave the borders, but when he arrived at the borders, he was turned back. I wonder, he murmured, how my high-minded brothers would feel about, or how my high-minded brothers at the conference now feel, having failed with integrity, when a little bit of trickery would have saved them. "But Gleason," said his wife, "is it not true that had we rejected the space traders' offers, blacks would have simply been blamed for all domestic problems in the United States? An increase in debt, increase in pollution, and fuel shortages. While we might have saved ourselves in this one instance, would not our fate have been just as dire in the United States as what potentially awaits us in space?" January 17th. On the last Martin Luther King Jr. holiday the United States would ever observe, it was an incredible sight to behold. Along the shore was 20 million black men, women, and children, including babes in arms. They looked back to the shoreline, but were greeted only with the sight of United States soldiers standing guns at the ready on the dunes. They looked forward. There was no escape, no alternative. Heads bowed down, arms linked in slender chains. All African Americans were about to leave the world, the new world, in the same way that their ancestors had arrived. There was no escape. Our argument is that narratives are good. Fisher says that they are ubiquitous, inevitable, and the strongest way to engage in the topic. Our first argument under this is that we believe that the narrative offers up an opportunity to include more minority rights and discussions in the debate space. We have 56 teams to the NPTE, over 112 individuals, and yet look at the top-seeded round. It's filled with white people who have the right to speak. Virtually all white audience. White people are going to be able to enjoy this recording later. We operate in an exclusive space. The next argument is that, moreover, it appeals to foundational interests and established forms of debate, focused only on anticipating hypothetical outcomes that subverts the ability to explore knowledge in new ways and from a standpoint of epistemology. For this reason, we support this narrative as a way to positively engage in the topic.
The order will be 2 off the case.
Can you say that again?
The order will be 2 off on the case. Jesus Christ.
When you say case, do you mean narrative good, or did you flow the narrative in some way?
I mean the narrative's good. But I will be referencing your narrative. Sure. Ready?
Debate has become the aesthetic theater. The after has commoditized injury like securities and the liberal economy is suffering. The ballot has become a supermarket. We're seeing ethics of fetish. The app turns left into a wounded and rotting corpse. They imagine themselves rescuing round after round. Their appeal to empathetic identification is a form of social death-making that ensures the smooth functioning of imperialism. Ultimately, only an outright rejection of the entirety of liberal ethics, aesthetics, and politics is sufficient to break this famous empirical cycle. The links. The first argument is the app's presentation of suffering creates a commodity, turns the suffering into a commodity which they trade on a specific economy. The ace one is that they cut down to size. They cut down the size of the root cause of problems into simple, lacks of discussion into simple, lacks of acknowledgement of the problem, whereby obscuring the way in which the liberal pedagogy of optimism controls our pathos. The decent one is that the second argument is they are guardians of suffering, reduced left to a victimized, and when informed that they promise that they can solve in a regime. The decent one is their act of mourning is an act of social death making and performs the evacuation of significance from actually an existing subject. The decent one is that the domestication of suffering into pain, and the translation of this pain into harm and injury is the process of admitting sufferers into the liberal economy of suffering. They must suffer and complain correctly. The C one is that the ass political sentimentality uses suffering empirically to drain significance from the subject, thereby making the injunction to empathy safe for the empathizer. The third argument is the absence of sentimental politics, which promises that empathetic identification can actualize an ethic of care and change. The eighth one is that it promises that a consensus already exists about what constitutes a good life, and thus a consensus about what the good life, what would bring the good life into being. The beast one is the app's ravenous for yearning for social change is functionally renormed. The fourth argument is putting your argument in debate space makes the combination of control of the national zeitgeist and pop modernity and pastime in the bourgeois America. The eighth one is the up-down valid form that requires a consensus to be produced about all consciousness produced to be ultimately shared and non-controversial, requires consensus about what winning means, what evil resides, and what death means. The decent one is the judge as the consumers to work through the space of diminished agency that is the ballot to affirm the moral legitimacy of the affirmative, while the debate community is to work through the scene of national trauma, extracting pleasure, pathos from a form of scholarship that requires trivial recognition and nothing else. The impact. The first argument is death making. The eighth one is they are aesthetics, priest, and insatiable instinct to power rule over not something in life, but over life itself. The beast one is bare life. The app takes it upon themselves to make absolute decisions over which life is valuable and what life must be, what life can be exterminated to power, which is ultimately preserved by their performance, makes violence inevitable in the way in which they give voice. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah. Could you tell me in one sentence what the fuck you're talking about right now?
Yeah, this seemed to be set up from a very different affirmative than what you said.
No, y'all are vampires.
We're vampires. That's right.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yes. The cease when it resulted on when the benefit of voting affirmative fails to materialize abuse is heaped upon the self-expanding suffering and eventually lead to violent lashouts and scapegoating as a problem is sought to be solved. The second argument is the turns case. The eighth one is the aestheticization of suffering is the conduit of possibility for the liberal economy of suffering injury to render invisible or relevant certain bodies, words, performances, and survival strategies. The beast one is the normative, renormative affirmative is guaranteed to justify ongoing forms of domination. Any discourse towards resistance is short-lived. Case in point is gay marriage, which reifies the sexist and heteronormative and patriarchal institution. The C someone is politicizing the violence of the historical past, relies on a racist and sexist victim economy whereby race bodies are made to dance for a white audience and for an infinitely deferred freedom, which creates a hierarchical and colonial dynamic that makes their oppression inevitable. The third argument is neoliberalism. The east one is liberal moralisms are the engine of modern warfare. The liberal economy is suffering. The supreme aversion is death. This awareness of persistent possibility, even actuality of war and death, necessitates preemptive wars and marginalizations. Iraq, for example, was legitimized to protect the traumatized American psyche, but the perhaps better example is that of the pinkwashing, the way in which certain marginalized populations, i.e. the queer population, is used and mobilized by the United States and Israel to justify interventions towards Iran because they are just not treating people good enough. The alternative. The alternative is to reject the affirmative's liberal economy of suffering. The alternative is to reject the affirmative's liberal economy of suffering. To solvency, the first argument is we must refuse the politics of liberalism and the economization of suffering. Nothing short of an outright rejection of the entirety of liberal ethics, aesthetics, and politics will solve. The second argument is our politics does not ignore the violence of the world. It refuses a particular set of representations, values, which would frame said suffering against the movement of life, of becoming of life. The third argument is the alternative does not wish away suffering, nor does it say we can resolve all of the violence of modernity, but can also open us up to experiencing the world not as zombies or vampires, but as sensuous beings. The fourth argument is this involves not giving liberal institutions or firm recruiters to various marginalities the power to set the terms of honoring the suffering and hope of others, and not giving them the power to corner our pathos in a moment of ethical noblesse by emphasizing how another suffering is impenetrable and unknowable. The fifth argument is a permutation against each one. It is definitely severance. If we are not going to win on frame, then you should not allow them to move away from the side of the performance of the one you see that we have isolated. Otherwise, it's fundamentally impossible for them to engage in. It destroys any educational value of reading their narrative in the debate space in the first place. The beast one is that if it includes, does not sever, then that's a vote for fairness in education. The beast one is that if it does not sever, then it necessarily includes the liberal economy suffering. All of our impacts are a reason why that gets co-op. Framework, or T. Our interpretation is that the affirmative must defend an instrumental affirmation of the resolution may only claim it often predicated off solely predicated off of the consequences of that instrumental affirmation. Our interpretation of the affirmative must defend an instrumental affirmation of the resolution may only claim often solely predicated off of the consequences of that instrumental affirmation. The violation is they do not even claim anything of as an instrumental affirmation, and all of their offense is predicated off the reading of the narrative, not over what is contained within the narrative itself. The standard, the first argument is limits. The east one is its predictability. The east one is the topic is the topic is the critical way to narrow the confines of debate, allow the negative and affirmative user 20 minutes of prep time effectively to subsequently engage in the discussion. The decent one is they infinitely explode the ground and become infinitely unpredictably because they can simply read a narrative about anything, and that becomes offense. The decent one is predictability is critical. The first is that it's critical to clash and preventing which is the only unique form of debate of education produced by Parley. Otherwise, Parley becomes a lecture hall whereby they tell us a neat, nice story, and we have to say that's probably funny or good. The second argument is that it's critical to competitive equity, and third, it's critical competitive equity and having a fair side and division of ground. The second argument is ground. There was no ground that is not entirely generic, and they circumvent the entirety of the topic. We don't get any of our China dissents. We didn't get any of our Kamali case turns of the UN imposition with the region. Now the voters. The first argument is fairness. Fairness is critical for a couple of reasons. The eighth one is it creates a competitive incentive for people to research and participate. People do not invest the massive amounts of time in the activity if there is no possibility of winning. The beast one is that it is the beast one is it's also critical for that's probably sufficient for fairness. The second argument is education. The eighth one is that education is uniquely critical to give us portable advocacy skills that we can use in the real world. But when there was never a we never set a limit to the terms of debate, then those portable advocacy skills are never actualized. The beast one is it's also necessary. Okay, fine. Third, you should gut check their appeal to debate is dead, and nothing that we could have talked about on the topic would have been productive. The research that I did on Mali was extremely informative, and I was going to love to read the criticism about the terrible instability uniqueness that you were probably going to read, but I did not get an opportunity to do that. Also, switch side debate solved to all of your options. You can critique it. It's going. No, I got 1 minute. Case. No, I got a minute. You could have asked it earlier. Case. Their narratives are not competitive. They could have read a narrative about Mali and talked about Mali through that lens. There was no reason why our interpretation shuts that up. But now they are the space traders trading black suffering, and they will not be able to not only count this frame. Their entire frame is that we produce a specific produce a specific vision, and then thus through the consumption of that vision, the consumption of that suffering, i.e., that white people do not want black folk for what they have, or that 1/2 of all black folk between 22 and 29 are in prison. Once we consume that suffering and that we take it throughout the process of the liberal economy suffering, that somehow solves or mobilizes an ethic of care. But they are the people, they are the fervent recruiters of various marginalities. They are the ones who admit them into an economy that ultimately co-opts them and destroys them.
Great. It'll be an overview that you should know. Then I'll talk about the last couple of things on the case. Then the topicality or framework argument, and then the critique.
So you're
There will be an overview first, and then that. Okay. Are we all good?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, now I'm good.
Okay. In the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, there's this perfect town without any pain or suffering. And the reason that everyone can live their lives in perfect bliss is because in the basement of the town hall, there's a child there who's imprisoned, who absorbs all of the pain and suffering of everyone who would have had to endure that suffering. And in order to live there forever, when you turn 18, you have to confront the child. You have to go down to the basement and see what the consequences of your actions are and see why your life is comfortable and perfect. Our argument is that essentially you're forced to choose to take responsibility for your actions and the consequences they engender, or relegate that suffering to an innocent individual while you just live a comfortable and privileged life. Our argument is that the metaphor of the ones who walk away from Omelas is analogous to the space traders. The negative just would hide this suffering and keep us in the dark about why we live a privileged existence within the debate space. The affirmative recognizes this and pulls back the veil to create change and asks you to confront the child and confront why we are privileged within the debate space, what kinds of narratives are permissible now. This is a metaphor for every person in team who is systematically excluded by the method of debate that the negative engages in. Those are the kinds of people who cannot even hope to qualify to this tournament or don't want to try to qualify to this tournament because they would be marginalized and excluded because they do not engage in the kind of debate that the negative team would have us engage in. Go to the narrative's good arguments. The first argument they say is that we could have read a narrative about Molly. Our argument is that we do read a narrative about the topic. Our argument is about the story. Our argument is that the story explains why we should do the topic because the topic talks about the story. We'll talk about the history of colonization that underlies the history with Molly. Our method asks why we need to do the topic in the first place. We are only obligated to answer the question, should we or should we not to the resolution. How the affirmative answers that question is fundamentally up to us. In addition, you could have read a counter-narrative or indicted our method of engagement with the topic, which we fundamentally do, which probably indicates we do read a narrative about the topic. The next argument they say is that we trade black suffering, which leads to consumption of suffering and marginality. Our argument is that you create a forced choice between either not including these types of narratives and just leading the privileged life that you currently lead, or doing the gesture of the affirmative to use these kinds of narratives in the debate space, or at least allow them to be permissible within the debate space. Which probably means that we do not consume this kind of suffering. Even if we do, it's probably good because it means that we have the opportunity to include more people in the debate space. Your argument would foreclose upon that possibility and leads to marginalization. Marginalization is happening in status quo. They are too behind the uniqueness question of whether or not debate is inclusive and allows these kinds of arguments to be permissible now, which means marginality is the status quo. There's no unique impact to this argument. In addition, you can extend the argument about how it leads to hypothetical outcomes. Appeals to hypothetical outcomes is bad. This is the argument that Hale reads. That they concede, which means the narratives are fundamentally good for us as individuals within the debate space. It probably means at the point at which they don't bring the kind of narrative that allows us to engage in breaking down normative debate arguments. That means that it will always lead back to this offense. It means that their method is not a preferential go to the theory page. The first argument they say we have to be instrumental for affirmation of the resolution. We make this argument because of the arguments that I say in case across by those here about why we are an affirmation of the resolution. The next argument they say is the only impacts about the consequences of the affirmative. Our argument is that we do talk about the consequences of the affirmative. Our counter interpretation is that we just have to defend the topic that we are only obligated to answer the question how should we not do the resolution. How we answer that question is up to us, which means that we are topical under this framework. The next argument they say the next argument is that our framework arguments. The first argument is all debates are representational. You can see arguments that indicate the narratives are inevitable, which means it's only a question of what kind of narratives we allow within the debate space, which means fiat is not real. All that matters is a way of understanding our relationship to the topic and to the debate community, because representations are all we can take with us outside the round. We should work to create safe spaces for narratives. All we are doing in the debate is sharing stories. Narratives are inevitably only a question of what kind of narratives are allowed, and you marginalize these kinds of narratives, which means that you destroy ground for people who cannot access the debate community now, which probably outweighs any risk that they are marginalized. There's no impact to participation, no impact to limits or predictability or fairness in a world in which their method of debate would just produce a bankrupt and exclusionary system of debate. There's no impact to participation in that kind of activity. The next argument is that on the myths they talk about predictability. Our argument is that predictability is probably bad in this instance because it employs the efficiency principle in the way in which the best way seems what we've already had a million times with terms. Any of their education arguments that they'll try to go for, but in addition we'd say that the creation of methods of debate, there's certain methods of debate were particular understanding of the world, and if we continue to debate within the same parameters of debate, we cannot question existing knowledge or new possibilities outside the scope of what is already possible. Makes us have the same discussion over and over, which means that all of their arguments about prep time and the topic narrows debate are probably bad. In addition, their interpretations of acceptability are probably bad because they overrule ethical decision making by blindly following the letter of law without allowing change from the ethical perspective. This will allow judges to decide that you can legally take upskirt photos in states like Oregon and Massachusetts and Nebraska or elsewhere because the status quo says that we should have a very narrow interpretation of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, which means that is the impact of the kinds of arguments that they are talking about on this argument. In addition, fairness is self-serving. It begs the question for whom. They are conceding arguments that indicate that debate is privilege-based now, which means that there's no impact there, fairness being lost. But the next argument, you can go to the criticism. The first argument is there, a forced choice between normative debate and exclusion of these voices, which means probably outweighs every single one of their arguments. We are not a commodification of any kind of victimization or narratives. They do not make any specific link arguments to our affirmative, which means probably set up for a very different affirmative than one we read. They'll try to go for arguments in the block that are brand new, but do allow the people a lot of flexibility to answer those arguments because they have not identified a single specific link to what kind of narrative we read or how we advocate for the resolution. In addition, we do not modify these voices. We just say that they should be allowed within the debate space, and we use our position of privilege in order to deconstruct the normative debate that you engage in, which probably means that you commodify these voices and relegate them to an excluded space now, which probably means that outweighs any risk of your arguments because your arguments are inevitable in a world your kind of debate. Things like bare life and marginalization are inevitable in a world which those people will never have access to the debate community, which is our most proximal location. But in addition, we'd say that we can probably preview your alternative. The first argument is you can endorse the app and reject the economy of suffering. You can endorse the affirmative and reject the economy of suffering. Our argument is that that would probably be most not beneficial because it includes the narrative that one you see and methods of debate that do not reward a particular understanding of the world. It says that those kinds of narratives are not permissible within the debate space now, which means we do not relegate those. We do not relegate people who cannot access the community now to just being excluded. Your alternative would basically just say either debate like us or get the fuck out of debate, which we say is a messed up perspective on how we should view the debate community, which is probably why people are marginalized and cannot access the debate community are leaving in droves now, which probably indicates that which probably is a disact of your alternative alone, because not only do you engage in normative debate, but you engage in a model debate that would tell those people just get the fuck out. In addition, we'd say that your alternative is bad because it fetishizes authenticity, because you engage in your movement in one which we're like ethically pure and only engage in your method of debate. We have disacts your method of debate and the reason and the way that you engage with the topic. But in addition, we'd say that's another link to the marginalization that we're talking about, because you deny people access into your movement, which probably means that they can never have access to this, and you can never solve the kinds of impacts that you're talking about because the same voices will only have access to your forum over and over and over, which will only produce the same kinds of ideas over and over, which means that you will never create change. You will never create change, and it's better to have a risk of commodifying voices and a risk of like language of victimization or whatever link arguments you go for, then just not have those voices at all, which means that is the forced choice that they are making you decide. Either include these voices and have a risk that it might go poorly, or definitely never include those voices and only come up with the same solutions over and over, which we say is reprehensible given the debate community now does not include those kinds of voices, which we say we can use our position of privilege to deconstruct the way in which their arguments and their method of debate would systematically exclude those people, which we say is bad. It doesn't matter if any of their impact arguments are true. You can grant them a full risk of those arguments. They have not made a single offensive reason why a method of our affirmative is bad. They just say that there's a risk that these voices might be commodified, but they're definitely excluded now, so those impacts are inevitable.
The order is framework, and then the overview to the critique, and then the critique, and then the overview to the 2AC. I would probably.
Go again.
Yeah. It'll be TE, and then it will be the critique,
Okay.
straight down. There will be an overview on top, and then it will be the. Then it will be narratives and the case of change. I will answer the 2AC overview on top of the critique.
What, the K you said?
On top of the K, yeah.
And just so you know, whoever is next door is like loud back here, so if you're not like.
Okay, I will.
Framework not going for it. I don't know why Martin read it. You can extend the argument that all debate is representational, which means that there's no offense in this debate. We are running representations links about how y'all are vampires. Go to the overview page. The first argument is you are white. You are not white knights. You are vampires. There's no reason why you are able to actually deconstruct via your privilege. You have been reading this argument prior to this debate. There have been people reading this argument within the debate since 2000. Jallin's been reading narrative since before we were all born, and we have not resolved the problem of people being excluded within the debate space, which indicates that you have absolutely zero solvency, which gives us credence to our arguments about how y'all are just vampires and how you are extracting your own jouissance and saying that you are good people and everyone should like you. But when you go out into the real world, you notice that nothing has changed. You do not have a way to engage within the world, and that is a reason why you not only do not have solvency, but you are only commodifying the rest of the world. Go to the critique. The first argument is that the affirmative is a mirror of our confusion, dishonesty, and panic, trapped and immobilized in the sunlit prison of the American dream. When we come to the marketplace for justice, we no longer know if we had a suffering to speak for. The affirmative can be seen as taking the next step from brokering our injuries to rendering them currency or something more like future speculations, completely skipping the labor and suffering as mediators of this value to some degree. This resonates with the financialization endemic to neoliberalism as it returns to the liberal theory of value altogether and it returns to the fidelity of classic liberalism. Liberalism's colonization of suffering and its moral dominion over this needs to be resisted and loosened. The alternative holds on to the ability to suffer in ways that do not necessarily follow liberal logic as something to be striven for, grasped anew, and salvaged from the arbitrary dissipations imposed upon it by global power, who do not only refuse to take responsibility for the plight that have every role in creating and locating, but also shamelessly arbitrate how the wounded can make their suffering matter. Look at that. They are two white people. Never in this debate do they isolate how they are implicit within these structures that they attempt to break down. They have not isolated how they are related to the resolution or to their own narrative in any way, shape, or form. They will get up and say, well, we chose to do this, but that does not articulate how Liz and Cale particularly are affected by the forms of exclusion which they isolate within their narrative, which indicates that they have not localized themselves. They are instead just using the suffering to win ballots within this round so that they can go 12-0 at the NPTE and feel good about themselves. That is not a good way that we should embrace, that we should engage with suffering. That is not a way that resolves the question of suffering. Their first argument is that it is a forced choice and that their impacts would outweigh the K. Our argument is that it is not a forced choice because it is not a question of narratives or the SQUO. It is a choice between narratives or the alternative, which is a authentic engagement with suffering, and that is not something that they have been able to grapple with. They have conceded the arguments on the alternative page, which indicate that we are able to actually engage with embodies in it on a way that is not on a liberal economy of suffering, that we need to reject the liberalism and politics in order to be able to affirm the value of the form of life, which is not necessarily only the white form of life, but all forms of life, which means that we are able to resolve the violence that they talk about in a world where we no longer seek to merely win ballots on the stage, which is called round 6 of the NPTE, but actually seek to engage with suffering on an authentic level. I have noticed that there is problems within this debate community, but I have not seen there would be a large output outside of debate tournaments. People go back to their schools and talk about their own things, but don't talk about the violence. They only talk about violence within the debate community when they come here and when they have the possibility of winning rounds or beating other teams on that violence, which indicates that they are not authentically engaged with it and are instead only using it for pragmatic means. Their next argument is that they don't commodify. They have not answered any of our link arguments, which are pretty specific. Additionally, Martin makes a couple even more particularized link arguments on the case debate. The first one of those is that they are the space traders. We get it. Planet Earth is the spaceship, but our argument is that there is literally no reason why they are not space traders, and they just like there are aliens that come to say we want to take all your black folks so that we can and then you need to make a forced choice. It is the same thing here. They say that we will resolve you of your moral sins and you just have to give us your ballot and then that will solve everything. That is not the way it works, and that is not an argument that they are answering, which indicates that they do commodify suffering. They do reduce it to an up-down ballot count. They have conceded that in a world where they bring this argument into a competitive debate space and isolate that they should win the debate, it becomes more about a consensus about winning than about morality, and this affirms a transcendental morality that has absolutely no questions. It turns questions of suffering into something that we all get scholarship money for and all get a trivial degree of happiness from, which is not a way that we can actually resolve questions of suffering in the real world. They say that our links aren't specific. I've already answered that argument. They say that you should allow PMR flexibility. These arguments were all in the 1NC dog, not going to give you new answers. You say you don't commodify, which allowed new, and that you allow new suffering in debate space. We argue that you only allow these people within the debate space via your ballot. You do not make movements outside of this round to help people enter the debate space, and if you do, that is a good thing, but it is not a reason why you should win this round. Our articulation is that using it within this debate space is not the way to go about it, and it's actually counterproductive insofar as it seeks to affirm specific values to specific bodies while rendering other ones disposable, and it affirms the ability of specific fervent recruiters of various marginalities to understand certain bodies as valuable and other bodies as invaluable, which is precisely the problem of bare life in the first place, because it allows people to be excluded. Our argument is that they are at the root cause of the violence and of the exclusion. They say that people aren't allowed to access the debate space now. They have conceded that they are not capable of getting anybody into the debate space. That is the articulation out of the 1NC, which means it is try or die for the alternative for an authentic engagement with suffering. They say that permutation endorse the affirmative and reject the liberal economy of suffering. They have conceded the entirety of the permutation preamps first. We will win the argument that liberal economies of suffering are entirely mutually exclusive with the representations of the 1AC insofar as they say that you should endorse a narrative with your ballot. That is an articulation of how they are commodifying the injury that they articulate in the 1NC, which indicates that they would necessarily be severing if they were to have legitimate permutation, which they have conceded is a voter for fairness in education because they create a moving target. It is not a question about the framework debate, which indicates that their answers to fairness in education are not applicable here. It is a question of whether or not the negative gets to compete in the debate space at all, which is not the same thing as having predictable access to the debate space. Additionally, it is not even a question of that because in a world where they are able to sever from their own representations, it replicates the structure of whiteness, whereby they can project their own flaws and say that I am flawless and I will be able to resolve the problems that you all have created for yourselves, which indicates that they would never be able to solve for any of the critique or even the 1AC of the severance permutation. But they have also conceded that if it's not severance, then it means that it includes the liberal economy of suffering because they are still asking for the ballot. Look at it. They're saying that even if we are wrong, you should still vote F, which is a commodification of the entirety of the 1NC criticism. It says that we should just turn this argument into a tool for the affirmative to win ballots. The next argument is they see the movements they said we deny access to movements. Our argument is that your movement is flawed and that your movement should be rejected. We do not need to win the argument that we create a coalition with Oregon WF because we think that the way that they have engaged within this debate space is flawed. This is the MPTE. I don't have time. I'm sorry. They make the argument that you can only access this via the negative framework. That's irrelevant. They say that they say the use of position of privilege to deconstruct this. They have not articulated how they are implicated within the debate space. They have conceded that they commodify injury. There's one more link argument. This is the second one. Martin's one about reducing life to victimhood. This is also implicated in the 2AC, where she reads an entirely different narrative and says it is precisely the same structure as the first one. All suffering is the same in their book. They're the white knights that get to go out and say that we think that's not true. We think that they cause a destiny impacts.
I have a question.
What was?
Yeah, what is your method of allowing these voices in the debate space if it's not like a forced choice? Because narratives are inevitable, right? So what narratives do you allow in the debate space?
We allow narratives that are located within a subject position.
And we don't think they should be endorsed
So
by the
only
ballot.
your
And we don't think that they should be endorsed by them. Go to the W. The first argument is that you can extend death making. You've conceded that you resolve in the bare life, which indicates that marginalization becomes inevitable. That turns the entirety of the case. You've also conceded the resentment argument, which is pretty good. They conceded that when people leave the debate round and they fail to resolve the question of violence, they go out and they ask, why haven't I failed this? And then they lash out. The way they lash out is not necessarily externally violent. It's with things like jokes, which cause fractures within the community and cause people to leave this community because they feel marginalized by violent jokes that make fun of various stereotypes. It's happened. People have been excluded for that reason.
Okay, the order will be decaying. Ready?
The PMR is going to look like this. It's going to be a giant uniqueness claim that says people are excluded. Well, guess what? This is a competing methods debate, and for you have not read a single argument that says the debate space is good, or the form of the debate space that uses the ballot to endorse specific individuals is a good form of a good methodology. So there was literally no offense to any of their movements. Arguments. Our criticism massively outweighs the concession of the impact. Means you cannot vote negative because even if it's inevitable, it's also inevitable in the world of the alternative. Given the concession of Miller's argument, they've conceded a couple of impacts. First is that making the ability to allow for specific individuals to become valuable via the presentation of the 1EC is what gives the power to specific individuals to render other bodies fundamentally without value. The second is that it turns the case. They've conceded the resultant impact. They've also conceded the liberal economy impact and a structural claim about how these kind of financial mechanisms necessarily prevent any sort of authentic movement that would not authentic, but any sort of productive movement from ever actually articulating itself, because it just becomes too easy for that system to say, yeah, we know what you need to do. Yes, we know the correct methodology to bring the good life into being, but that is fundamentally renormative and necessarily excludes bodies. I really do not know how they are going to go for just a uniqueness claim when they do not have a solvency mechanism for narratives. This is the problem with reading 1 minute of narratives good that doesn't even have a warrant. You don't have a counter method. Now, the alternative, this is where I want to start. They have not answered any of the alternative solvency mechanism. the key distinction is that we do not use the ballot, and you have not made a single argument for why the debate space via the ballot is particularly productive, which is also damning for you when you're just saying that framework sucks and that we don't get education, and never make a counterclaim for why your education via the ballot would be fundamentally good besides inclusion, but you have conceded that that form of inclusion is renormative and excludes people. So what are you getting out of this? You have conceded that the alternative does not wish weight suffering. The third solvency point, rather, it has authentic engagement with suffering that allows us to understand it in a better and more productive way that does not lead to the kind of co-optation you have talked about. You've conceded the fourth solvency argument. I think this should be the round winner. We disallow the power, the ability of liberal institutions and fervent recruiters of various marginalities to corner specific individuals in specific ways, to say that we are the liberators, to say that we are the ones who give you agency and value, which fundamentally solves back, because at its root, that is how violence functions as articulated by you, because whiteness needs to allow certain bodies in, then doesn't allow other bodies in, and we say, fuck that, that process is terrible. Now the link level, do not allow the PMR to re-articulate no links when they were not made in the MG. Instead of just saying there weren't them, and you should have read no links, and you didn't. You have conceded that the presentation of 1AC via the ballot, the fourth link, is a commodification of suffering, and there was literally not an argument that you can possibly make against this. This is not just a good authenticity test, even if they win that Listen Kale are authentic debaters. They have conceded that the way in which that is consumed by the debate space is necessarily co-opted, is a form of co-optation. They've also conceded a litany of reasons how the ballot minimizes suffering, it simplifies the subject, makes empathy good for the empathizer, but it's fundamentally not good for the people that they are trying to let in, because it creates a simplified and a version that is never able to articulate themselves. Their impact to people being excluded is not uniqueness for you, it's uniqueness for us, and you've conceded that an authentic engagement with suffering would actually be able to solve the problem, but you could not. Not the case. All that's here is a bunch of uniqueness claims, and that should really frame your ballot. When they say we try to solve the problem, ask yourself, did they make a single solvency claim in the 1AC? No, but were there solvency deficits that seem to be proven by a litany of empirics in the 1AC? Yes, there were, and they do not solve, but even if they allow people in, they've conceded that the way in which they allow people in, the way in which they are gatekeepers, colonial and hierarchical gatekeepers, is bad. They are the slave traders. They do not solve, only the alternative can.
Okay, it's going to be Liz's overview that she gave in her speech, and then the framework arguments from their T/framework page, then their criticism, and then from there. Everybody good? Yeah? The negative is conceding that all debate is representational and everybody's standing up and reading narrative. They seem to they misrepresent the idea that we are sitting here reading a narrative, and their criticism is somehow separate from that notion. We say that all of debate is representational, everybody's just standing up here reading narratives, which means that the only question at the end of the day is the methodology in which we engage with narratives and the way in which we open up spaces. We will win the way in which Oregon has gone about trying to create change and create spaces preferable to the methodology of the negative. Extend Liz's arguments that say that we need to confront the child. Their argumentation still continues to keep the child in the dark and never allows us to move on and confront the problems in which we continue to face. We will be winning arguments on dissents we will be winning the dissents to the alternative loan, which explain more clearly why it is you cannot ever hope to create change via your alternative loan. Move on to their framework page again. Extend our arguments that all debate is narratives. They misrepresent this idea. They claim on the criticism page that it is simply a question of, it's not a question of the narratives versus status quo, but a question of narratives versus our alternative. Again, they somehow have in their mind that the alternative is separate from the narrative. They are standing up and reading in their own version of narratives. All arguments are simply narratives, which means that you will never win any kind of offense on that. The next arguments go down to criticism proper. Okay, first I want to respond to their arguments, say that the way in which we engage our narrative never creates cycles of change, because our narrative can never produce like new policies, things like that. But I would say that we have preempted this argument. Our narrative does create change. You think that our only argument is the 1 minute narrative is good at the bottom of the argument, but you ignore our litany of arguments which are included within the narrative ourselves, which is what we were talking about. Gleason no lightly said that you cannot create more policies and expect actual change, because when you simply sit within the system, as Gleason no lightly did, and expect change to happen once the system comes down and starts starts to fuck you, it will abandon you at the first cause, which means we cannot do things like advocate for positions of change and expect change to actually happen. We have litanies of arguments which you continue to ignore because you think that all we're saying is some narrative which must therefore be meaningless and create no change, but you ignore the litany of arguments we have in response to that. The next argument I want to drop down to that's the alternative. First of all, I want to extend Liz's argument that says you fetishize authenticity. They have no true responses. They say that the only way in which we can engage with this is some kind of authentic purity. You can never be able to beat this because you don't know the position of privilege we come from. We don't know the position of privilege you come from. We question this position all the way from the one when we know that we are all a bunch of white people standing up here and that we can never create change unless we do things like create new spaces for the alternative, which means that there will be no way for anybody to participate in your movement there. Because you are right, there is a uniqueness claim here. We do think that there is all about the methodology. Debate is exclusionary now. We will never solve that exclusionary if we stick only to authentic purity and fetishizing authenticity only by creating new spaces and taking the risk of the narrative that the affirmative race is never able to solve back to this. You will never be able to solve back to this alone. The best way to solve this is via the permutation system. We should allow for narratives like the kind that we read for, which is able to create new spaces while also questioning the liberal
Economy of suffering.
the liberal economy of suffering. We think that this is best able to solve this because it doesn't fetishize authenticity. It says we don't recognize which position of privilege every single person around comes from, but that we should be able to open up spaces for new kinds of arguments like narratives while at the same time questioning the liberal economy of suffering. It solves best because it doesn't link to the fetishization of authenticity, because we recognize that there is no need to fetishize authenticity because we don't know the position of privilege we come from. We don't care that Joe Allen might have read this exact same argument. We never read this argument before. There's only a risk that continuing to do these kinds of things are going to lead to change within the debate space, which means that we have a clear net benefit of the permutation.
Yeah, that is why it's a forced choice between either saying get the fuck out or possibly opening the
Right,
space.
this is also linked to the exact same argument Liz made on the child. This is exactly why you are creating a forced choice. Because you fetishize authenticity, you will never allow for us to truly confront the child because we can't see past our own versions of authenticity, which means that the best way to do this is to confront the child, do the gesture of the affirmative, and question the liberal economy of suffering, which they will solve back to that. Go on to the narratives page now. I think we are just way ahead on the arguments that we say. We engage in talk. We use our narratives as a more productive means of engaging. We don't engage in hypothetical outcomes, but instead recognize the narrative as exploratory potential to expand the grounds, expand the debate space as a safe sphere for increased minority participation and increased standpoint epistemology. This is the only way we'll ever create change. We break away from status quo politics and create a new ethic within the debate sphere, which is the only way we can solve. Anything else you want, Liz? All right, that's good enough.